We're going to start the recording now. Please be aware you're being recorded.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Good morning. Welcome to the Mitigation Working Group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. I'm Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager at MDE. Note that we are recording the meeting for note-taking purposes, so please mute your microphones unless you're trying to speak to the group. It's great seeing so many people with us today. Are there any MWG members who are joining by phone, or is there anyone standing in for?
This is Gail Myers. I'm sitting in for Steve Darcy with Prince George's Soil Conservation District. And I'm joined by phone because my computer will be taken over by IT around 10:30.
Great. Thanks, Gail.
This is Mariana Rosales. I am joining by proxy for Michelle Dietz of the Nature Conservancy.
Thanks for joining us, Mari. Oh, hold on. Chloe, I see you talking to us, and it looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Okay. I think Chloe's going to take to the chat. But by her signature, I'm guessing she's standing in for our BGE member today. All right. Well, thank you all for participating in today's meeting. For members of the public, we'll leave some time later in the meeting to hear public comments and give everyone an opportunity to participate in today's discussion. I'm also realizing on the screen I made a terrible choice in wearing plaid, so I apologize if it's very, techno on your side of the screen. Kim and Mike, would you like to make any opening remarks?
Just one brief one, and I apologize. Somebody's cutting the grass outside my window. But last year, the mitigation work group and the commission sort of ran out of time to finish discussions on funding issues. Some other issues sort of took over and preempted some of the discussion. And so the purpose of this is to get that back on our agenda for consideration. We do recommendations at the end of each year. Last year, we made some recommendations on funding, but they were rather limited. So the discussion was to try to start with some discussion of what the need for money was, and then as time permits, moved into ideas for raising it, with the idea of shaping our recommendations for this year on funding issues.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I don't really have anything except to let you know, as of this morning, 3,358 bills have been introduced in the General Assembly. So we're up and running.
An all-time record.
Yeah. By our count and workload, approximately half of them are climate bills. So that's a lot of fun. Thanks, Kim. Before turning to today's agenda, I want to provide just a few updates from MDE. I'm happy to share that thanks to Governor Moore's commitment to implementing the Climate Solutions Now Act, we have onboarded new staff in MDE's climate change program. 6 new staff, including my new policy division chief, and 3 new staff in a new building decarbonization section started within the last few weeks. 1 more person will be joining our team next week, and we expect to open recruitments for several additional staff this spring. It's great to be building the team for climate action. Speaking of building decarbonization, Maryland joined California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Rhode Island in announcing 2 weeks ago that all 9 states have set a collective goal for heat pumps to meet at least 65% of residential scale heating, air conditioning, and water heating sales by 2030. States like Maryland, where heat pumps already outsell fossil fuel heating systems, could set goals that are more ambitious than the collective goal set by the coalition of states. Maryland's forthcoming Clean Heat Standard and Zero Emission Heating Equipment Standard, which we announced in the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan, will be among Maryland's policies to achieve these goals. And finally, last MDE update before we turn to the agenda. On Friday last week, Governor Moore was joined by Secretary McElwain, Kim Coble, and others to announce $90 million in additional funding to accelerate the state's efforts to reduce energy costs, improve air quality, and cut climate pollution, especially in communities that need the greatest support to transition away from fossil fuels. That announcement included $50 million for electrifying fossil fuel equipment in community buildings like hospitals, schools, and multifamily buildings. $23 million for electric vehicle charging stations in low and moderate income neighborhoods, and $17 million for electric school buses at public schools. And in many ways, that's a great segue and setup for today's discussion. So Friday's funding announcement helps us dive into today's topic, which is really focused on the investments that we called for in Maryland's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan. As Governor Moore said last week, the announcement of $90 million is just a down payment on a larger investment that's needed to help Marylanders further reduce energy costs and allow the state to achieve its climate goals. The objective of today's meeting is to review the scale and types of investments that are called for in the climate plan, to hear your thoughts on those investments, and then to review the potential funding sources that are floated in the climate plan. Afterward, Kim's going to provide a legislative update, which could include mentioning some legislation that would create some of the new funding sources that are mentioned in the climate plan. So with that, let me open up a slide deck and talk through some of these investments. Okay. So essentially what the climate plan says, and is no surprise, and we started talking about a long time ago here at the Mitigation Working Group, is that additional dollars are needed to be invested in Maryland's economy to achieve Maryland's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So we estimate that billions of dollars of investment is needed this decade in order to achieve Maryland's GHG reduction goal of 2031. And of course, these are investments in energy efficiency, building electrification and electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, renewable energy, alternative transportation, all the things that we at the MWG have been talking about for really years now. A couple of different studies, including the study for the Pathway Report, and then an independent study by another group, attempt to put a price tag in terms of that total investment. And those, the total investment figures are, come in the 16 to 18 billion dollars range, and that's total investment. So, keep in mind that that's, if you were to go out and buy an electric vehicle, that's your own investment of money to buy the electric vehicle. If you take advantage of the federal tax credit, that's the federal investment. If you get the state tax credit on that, that's the state investment, right? It's all these pots of money coming together to make up that total investment, but it adds up to billions of dollars of investment this year. And of course, as we make those investments, we start to benefit from the energy savings and begin to realize the return on investment. And what we saw in the economic modeling for the climate plan is that the return on investment through 2031 looks a number of ways, right? It's reducing energy costs for Marylanders. It's creating an additional 27,000 jobs. It's adding up to $321 million in public health benefits. It's increasing personal income statewide by $2.5 billion. It's increasing the state's gross domestic product by $5.3 billion. And oh yeah, it's happening to help keep our planet habitable for ourselves and for future generations. So it's significant returns on investment. But of course, where a lot of the conversation goes is, how do we come up with the dollars today to invest in a brighter future? And where do those dollars come from? So in the plan, we called for an additional $1 billion per year in public funding to help stimulate the private investments that are needed and to help target investments to communities and projects that are in most need of public support. So we call for $1 billion a year, and note that that is funding that is needed in addition to any funding that would be needed to implement MDOT's climate plan. You might recall from the presentation last week, and I apologize, I was sick and I missed the last MWG meeting, but I know Chris Hoagland gave an overview, and I think there's a companion presentation from MDOT. So do remember that there's the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan, and then as an appendix, there's MDOT's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan focused on the infrastructure investments that are needed to reduce vehicle miles traveled and do all the other things that MDOT calls for. The investments needed for MDOT's plan is separate from the investments needed to implement MDE's plan, which focuses on, of course, vehicle electrification, building electrification, you know, and a number of other measures. So where we're focusing this conversation is the $1 billion of public funding that's called for to implement MDE's plan, right? And what's the basis for that request? So we base that $1 billion on a number of different things. So some of this is very, very familiar to you all if you were part of the MWG's conversations over the last year. The mitigation working group spent a lot of time last year talking about what is a more equitable package of incentives to help people transition, especially low and moderate income and some middle income households transition to electric vehicles. And the mitigation working group and then the Climate Commission recommended a new structure for the state's EV incentives, which would provide a base rebate for income qualified people, basically middle income and lower income groups of a $2,500 incentive to buy an electric vehicle, with additional bonus incentives to help make it even more affordable for low and moderate income households. So you all came up with a package of recommendations based on the work of consultants. The Climate Commission endorsed your recommendations. MDE, in the development of the climate plan, adopted your recommendations. And you might recall that the price tag on that was about $360 million a year to provide those EV incentives to all Marylanders that would qualify. So 360 million is just one component to keep in your mind as we work up to what's the basis for $1 billion. Then separately, some of this information was pulled into the MWG, but just so you all are aware or reminded that from June until this just last month, a building energy transition implementation task force was meeting to look specifically at the investments that are needed in the building sector. And some of the analysis there showed that, for instance, if Maryland were to continue to offer the federal rebate incentive for home electrification, this is the program that's offering up to $8,000 to help a low, moderate, or middle income household install, heat pumps. If we were to keep those incentive programs running once the federal funding runs out, that could be a cost of nearly $500 million per year over like a 20-year basis. So that's just a little bit more to layer together, looking at critical building electrification to support LMI electrification, adding to incentives that were recommended by the Climate Commission for vehicle electrification, and all of a sudden, with just those two categories alone, you start building up toward $1 billion. We also looked within the building task force at incentives that may be needed in the commercial building sector, outside of maybe the multifamily buildings that would also benefit from the electrification incentives for homes. And, there we have an analysis from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab looking at a total investment of about $1 billion a year for the buildings that are covered by the building energy performance standards to achieve those standards. And then there's kind of an open question of, well, if there's a total investment needed of approximately $1 billion a year, what portion of that is suitable for public investment, right? Where is public investment needed and targeted to help some of those types of buildings be able to achieve the implementation of projects to achieve the standards? So all of these pieces kind of fit together and build up toward that $1 billion. And then we also kind of did some checks and balances and said, okay, well, how are other states investing their dollars, right? And what we saw is that several other climate leading states were putting in the very rough ballpark of about $1 billion per year on a per capita basis. Like if we were to right scale the investments of other states to Maryland on an annual basis, we come up with something in the general ballpark of around $1 billion a year in public funding. And then we also looked at public to private investment ratios or leveraging factors. And the federal government recently reported that when they look at the investments, the climate investments through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, they're seeing about for every $1 in public spending that they're doing on climate measures, they're seeing that matched with a $2 private investment. So in other words, you get $3 of investment for every $1 of public funding that you put in. So we started to think about, okay, well, if we're looking at something like a 1-to-2 leveraging ratio of public to private investment, that kind of scales right to think about a $1 billion state investment to achieve the total investment that's needed for achieving the 2031 goal. So that's a whole lot of different scattered data points that were part of kind of our internal thinking to help us build up toward the $1 billion that's called for in the climate plan. So just in terms of scale of request, that's roughly where the scale of the request is coming from. And then what we see in the plan is that we are calling for that $1 billion to be invested in a few very specific critical areas, right? So home energy efficiency and electrification. And to flesh this out a little bit more, let me actually read this part of the plan, because we added just an additional sentence behind each of these bullets in the plan. So on home energy efficiency and electrification, the plan says that MEA will expand its offerings of consumer point of sale rebates and contractor incentives. Commercial, multifamily, and institutional building incentives, MEA and MCEC will scale up the distribution of grants and low interest loans for projects in large buildings. For EV incentives, MVA and MEA will provide point of sale rebates to help consumers purchase EVs and EV charging equipment. And again, the specific incentives were those that were recommended by the MWG and the Climate Commission. For industry, public infrastructure, and nature-based solutions, MEA, MCEC, MDE, DNR, DGS, and MDA will use and distribute funds in the form of grants and loans for different types of emission reduction and carbon sequestration projects. That, of course, could also include forestry projects to help grow more trees in Maryland. Then we've got workforce development. The Department of Labor will expand investments in apprenticeship and workforce development programs for electricians, heat pump installers, and other jobs needed for the clean energy transition. Consumer education campaign. MEA will amplify its promotion of rebates and tax credits that are funded by federal and state investments. And then finally, the Maryland Clean Buildings Hub, MEA will add capacity to provide technical support to building owners for building decarbonization projects. So those are the specific types of investments that are called for in the plan. The state is already investing in a number of these things already, but the idea is to amplify those investments with an additional approximately $1 billion per year of investment. So before turning to the potential funding sources that are called for in the plan, I think what we wanted to do is spend some time, and I'll ask the co-chairs to help kind of facilitate some of this conversation. We wanted to pause and get some input from the MWG on what you think of those planned investments, or what you think of the total scale of the state's.
I'm turning it on and off.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, I was explaining. I apologize for turning my camera off because my Wi-Fi is a little spotty. I'm finding it trying to get better. And I think that's a good idea. And I see Sandy has raised her hand. So Sandy, you want to start it off? And then Jennifer after that.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I guess one comment that I would make is more associated with the commission overall versus just the mitigation working group, but they're related. So if you would bear with me for 1 second. So when we're talking about the planned investments in terms of public funding and solutions, I think that we should also be doing it through the lens of resilience as well. And what I mean by that is that there are there's a lot of focus on the emissions reduction, which is what our primary focus is in the mitigation work group. But some of the investment strategies around emissions reduction, including transit-oriented development and some other strategies that are part of, the transportation plan, also have a need to include land use as a consideration, and also, what's going on in some of the areas of our state already. So when we're talking about the investments, I would just say, I think that we should be mindful of investments being made strategically that support and not exacerbate existing problems from a resilience perspective.
Make sure I understand what you're saying, Sandy. You said the focus is on not just incentives, but how we channel the existing investments. Is that the point?
Yeah. So where I'm going with that is just, we have areas of our state where we have additional flooding concerns, and we have subsidence occurring and some other things occurring at a state level. And I just want us to also be in conversations with our complementary working group about whether or not the strategies and investments that we're proposing are in line with what they are seeing from a resiliency perspective, and that they're providing co-benefits and not just a singular benefit on emissions reduction. That's
Gotcha.
all.
That makes sense to me, at least. And I think you also flagged the issue that for many of these, we want to look at what are the co-benefits, not merely greenhouse gas reduction.
Yes.
Jennifer, you got your hands up?
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to comment that I think all of those investments are very smart, but a key question for me is the sequencing of prioritization. And for me, the number one most important thing to do in the short term is the consumer education campaign around the federal incentives. And the reason that I say that is because there's such a good return on investment for getting federal dollars into our state to help solve our problem. And because realistically, looking at the polls, there is a very good chance that the next president will not continue those kinds of opportunities. And at the beginning of this meeting, Mark outlined how much it would cost the state to continue those subsidies if the state had to pay for them, which is an astronomical amount of money. So I urge us to have the consumer campaign be the very first thing that we do, and that we do it in a very robust way while those federal dollars still continue.
My own personal view is I think you've got a very good point there. I do think, I've pushed the idea of the electric cars a lot, because I think and I'm going to come back to this, most bang for the buck. And clearly there seems to be a lack of knowledge of what subsidies are available currently for that. Jamal, you have your hand up. And Kim, interrupt me anywhere here. I'm sort of taking the questions and answers, but feel free. Jamal?
Thanks. I agree with Jennifer. And I also think, in addition to the consumer campaign, focusing on workforce development is also pretty key. here just to make sure that we have enough contractors and workers that are able to help us meet these goals.
Arjun?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. I want to support Sandy Hertz's statement on resilience, but in a different sector, in addition to what she mentioned about flooding and so on, which is electricity sector resilience investments. I think, you know, um, writing out long outages has got to be, you know, and creating continuous power supply for essential services in every community has got to be a very important goal. And now we have long duration storage technologies that are coming up. I actually did a report on this. I'll put a link in this, and we ought to be thinking about incentivizing uh, microgrids that will support essential community loads without interruption during severe outages. And that is going to take substantial investment. And I didn't see that in the list. I think it should be a very, very high priority. And the other thing I'll say, which is also covered in this long duration storage report, is as we incentivize heat pumps and so on, you all know that I'm all on board with that, and it's a wonderful thing. We also ought to be making sure that the homes that are so incentivized are also equipped for demand response, and that they have smart internet enabled appliances so that they can participate in demand response. This report I'm going to put up has a calculation in which we simply examined if you dispatch demand response before battery storage when you have surplus renewable energy, does it make a difference? And you actually, if you give priority to demand response, you can reduce storage requirements very significantly. There was just a schematic calculation. And so just in terms of conservation of resources, the environment, how much material you need, how much lithium you need, it will make a huge difference. And so I'll put that link up. And I think those two things are very, very important and should have investment priorities. I don't know if it'll increase the $1 billion mark. It might well, but even if it is within the $1 billion, I think they should have high priority. Thank you.
Mariana?
Thank you, Kim. Of course, I am extremely happy to see all the progress that we have been doing and the effort that NDOT has reflected in the talk last meeting and the MDE. I'm just worried about who would be the one leading the effort to non-road and off-road strategies to reduce miles travel, because that certainly won't be MDOT. So I was expecting that most likely it would be MDE, but I didn't see so clearly express, like, are we really trying to reduce miles travel or not? And, you know, walkability, I don't know, bike trails, that sort of other strategies that are more difficult to put together, because I know that it a lot of times have to do with zoning regulation and they're more scattered. But I truly believe that it could be a big contribution. And also, I guess that everything related to public transportation would be mostly covered by MDOT, and that's why it was not mentioned, right? I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Sandy or Mark, do you want to respond to Mariana's point about where the VMT issue lies, which agency?
I'll take a stab at it. It's a shared responsibility is probably the easiest way to address it. There's funding available for certain strategies that can help with vehicle miles traveled that MDOT is already putting out through some of our programs, and that is also being complemented by funding that came to us through the carbon reduction program. However, a lot of the VMT real impactful movements that would get people to be, using transit and exploring alternative, like active transportation options, really comes down to the zoning. And yeah, you just put it in the chat. That's exactly where I was going. It comes down to local land use and zoning, and providing a structure at the county and municipal levels that will allow us to complement what they envision for their communities with these types of transportation options that would then allow people to have more possibilities of getting vehicles off the road. And the other thing that MDOT has that we do promote is, that's great, James. I ride my bike too, but it's only on days when it's warm enough and there's no ice. One thing that I would also say is that we have commuter choice and some of these other programs that have been served up to try to incentivize carpooling and other strategies, which also can play a role in VMT reductions. And I see that Darren has his hand raised, so I'll turn it over to my boss to add comments.
Thanks, Sandy. First, I want to agree with everything you just said, and I wanted to point out that if you look at our climate pollution reduction plan, which Mark mentioned, it's a complement to MDEs. The measures in our scenario potential new initiatives break down roughly such that 80% of them, the reductions from them, come from electrification of the vehicle fleet and VMT reduction. And they're about half and half. So about 40% for one, 40% for the other. So there's substantial VMT reduction measures included in that scenario. And there's others that we could support. And yeah, and MDOT plays a role here, but obviously it's an all of government approach to this.
Thanks, you guys. Nathan?
Yeah, let me add my thanks to the Maryland side for all the good work that went into this set of kind of general ideas, and also to the comments that we've gotten, I think all of which are really helpful, and I'm learning a lot just listening to the conversation here too. You had asked for a couple of input items. One was, is this the right roughly amount? My sense is, number one, let's, like as you have done, let the analysis kind of guide where we think we need to go with the investment amount. That homework has been, I think, done well already. Clearly, there's some additions we might do on different sort of sectoral approaches and whatnot that will, of course, be done as you're rolling out new proposals, or they're rolling out in the legislature. So all of that's, I think, for the good. And my own sense is that, yeah, we need that level in the order of $1 billion. We have to be thinking about this in a big way. And I sort of commend those who have put that sort of set of calculations, assessments together for kind of getting us to be thinking in the appropriately large sense for how we're going to really do this by 2031 and beyond. So I think I just want to underscore the kind of importance of the kind of large amount of investment that's been put on the table, kind of obviously refinement about specifically how and what is ongoing. But that's how we should be thinking about this. And I want to just emphasize for all of us that that's really something we need to be kind of always going back to. In a parallel kind of vein, I also agree with, like, yeah, let's I think there's the question of like what happens in November has come up. My own view on this is that we should, kind of go full speed ahead in either scenario. It makes sense for us to be educating people about EV tax credits and getting whatever federal kind of partnerships we can get set up as quickly as possible regardless of the election outcome. And I think that we should just be kind of mindful that that's kind of a both scenarios strategy. When it comes in terms of the federal government, when it comes to Maryland, though, I think that the key thing is the $1 billion, and we've got to recognize that's a lot, and it's going to take a lot of effort and focus to get that sort of through. It might take several iterations to kind of refine how we're going to do that. So my own view is, I'm all for the kind of like building the partnerships with the federal, but also not to lose sight of, in terms of the prioritization, not letting that sort of come first in terms of how we're thinking about tackling the set of things we have to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Nate.
And Jana.
But before Jana, I just wanted to point out, I mean, when setting aside the billion in state investment for a second and thinking about the total investment needed, and just going back to the good points that have been made already by several people about really promoting the federal incentives that are existing. If Marylanders really take advantage of the 30% tax credits that are available for installing heat pumps and electrical upgrades and renewable energy, and the $7,500 per EV and so on and so forth, right? Like, that's a whole lot of federal money that could be flowing into Maryland, and making up a very sizable chunk of the total investment, $16 to $18 billion, or whatever that total number, magic number is, of all of the money that's needed. I guess just reinforcing that it's for good reason that we put in the plan what we heard loud and clear from the Climate Commission, and Jennifer, thanks largely to your amplification of this, that a consumer education campaign is really important. Jana?
Yeah, so back to the VMT, I'm so sorry, but can someone remind me where we are in terms of including VMT strategies in the work plan? And if we're not there yet, is there like a smaller work group plan to sort of like evaluate the ROI of different VMT reduction strategies that, I know we used to have some smaller work groups that work on some issues, and it's hard to do something like that with so many people. And on the chat, I used to ride my bike on the roads too until I was gently nudged by an automobile. So maybe there's something to be said for working on some of these bike VMT reduction strategies.
I would say, Jana, within the MDOT piece, we have a 20% target for VMT reduction that was established. And Darren, correct me if I get this wrong, I believe that was by 2031.
And so is it then felt like we don't need to put it here because it's already kind of like baked into MDOT's own work plan?
I can't speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm relatively new to this working group. However, I would love for there to be a subcommittee established to look at our options. So this is certainly something that I've been here less than a year. Before coming here, I worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council for more than 20 years. And the vast majority of my time was focused on ways to reduce VMT. So I would love to be part of some sort of subcommittee or working group, or sub-working group, I guess you'd call it, tackling this as part of the.
And don't you worry, Darren. You'll be part of it. Yeah. The MWG steering committee is currently discussing its work plan for this year and piecing these things together. And we heard pretty clearly through last year's conversation, which, as many of you pointed out, focused a whole lot on vehicle electrification, and that's just part of the solution. So it's already kind of acknowledged that we wanted to spend some time this year looking at VMT reduction strategies, as Mike was mentioning earlier, really with the focus on the bang for your buck there, right? What type of strategies, when you look at the full range of, Darren, what did you just educated me about this the other day. The EPA is calling it transportation efficiency in terms of the whole range of.
Their shorthand for the suite of solutions is travel efficiency. So, right. And the challenge, but the opportunity is they work best when combined and not in isolation. But that makes, that means there's especially good grounds to dig into this.
So I guess just one quick flag, because I know as it did last year, it'll likely just keep on coming up. You know, when and how is the MWG going to focus its efforts, its conversations on these strategies? And I guess stay tuned, because that is something that the steering committee is currently discussing.
Bob, right?
Yes, this is, I think, a question from Mark. Of that $1 billion, how much do we think we have already in the pot? And how much are we striving for? And what fiscal year are we talking about?
Those are all good questions, Bob. So, I mean, when we're talking about additional funding, there's a significant amount of funding that's already put toward all these things. So additional really needs to, I guess, look at commitments made since the climate plan was announced. And, the first down payment, as the governor put it, was last Friday, the $90 million that was committed to a number of the things that are pointed at in the climate plan. The simple answer to when do we need all this additional funding to be available? 2031 is incredibly close as a goal to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 60%. So the earlier the better.
I think I'm next up. Two comments. One, Bob, just to follow up on yours, just so we're clear. I don't think there's very much state money in the coppers at all right now. The money which the governor announced yesterday, which is very welcome and a significant amount of money, as I understand it, is reserve funds from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. So it definitely is real money, but it's also not repeating money. We sort of use the reserve, and so it's available this fiscal year. I don't think that the reserve funds will be available next year, which really leads me to ask the tough question, which I think we do a good job of developing a wish list of the things that we would like incentives to be spent on. But as Jennifer sort of alluded to, I also think part of our job is to discuss priorities. If there's not $1 billion made available, if the General Assembly in their wisdom make only 500 million or some other number available, where do we get the most benefit from spending the money? And we've had discussions sort of in email on this over the last couple of weeks within the transportation sector of the bang for the buck. But how do we prioritize across sectors too? Is additional money on VMT or additional money on building electrification? If you had to fund one of them more than the other, where would you do? And I think Kim must want to comment on something I said. So Kim, you want to go ahead?
Basically, I too agree with you. I think the other thing that, if I were going to put a priority on the priorities, is to really work with the private sector, the financial structures on this money. As Mark said, there's $1 of state investment and $2 of private investment. And I think we're leaving money on the table by not engaging with the private financial systems.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I see it in some areas, for example, building electrification or the vehicle charging infrastructure. There may be opportunities to encourage additional investment with something that amounts to seed money. So it may, but that's
renewables too.
Yes, and renewables definitely, and there's also, and we've had this discussion before, there are non-monetary investments, right? I mean, renewables would greatly benefit if you could find some way to make the permitting process easier, as an example, that doesn't require cash, but would be an investment in the project. But I do think we need to have these discussions of If you had to pick one, what would it be? I mean, is it bike trails, or is it transit-oriented development? Is it extension of bus lines? Is it my own personal favorite, electrifying school buses? And I'm not saying to say that some of those should not be done, but if there are limited resources, what comes first? And maybe it's 50% of this and 25% of that, but if there are limited resources, it's not 100% of everything. And I'd like to open it to the floor and see if anybody has any particular thoughts about that. Or are they just as clueless as I am? Nathan?
So I just put this in the chat, but I'll just say it as well, because I think it's a great invitation for us to be thinking about how do we do those prioritizations? You know, what are the factors that we think are most important? And there's no one metric, right? I think this was something other people have mentioned and just came up in your comment. So there's no one right metric. It's kind of what do we want to learn more about in terms of what areas we can push most on? And, you know, the kind of emissions metric is like dollars per ton, you know, roughly, right? But there's lots of other ways to look at that. And even frankly, a dollars per ton is a kind of hard to estimate thing. There's usually not one number. It's a whole distribution of costs for different applications in the system. So all just to say, I think it would be great is if and as we are faced with that, something that I think could be a good area for us to be thinking about together. Just want to echo that.
Sandy, I think you're next.
Yeah, I'm going back to your question about you know, how do we prioritize, and I think that's the other reason that I was bringing up, you know, conversations with ARWG and brought up the local land use piece in one of the questions that was asked. I think, you know, part of the challenge that we have is that that readiness for deployment of strategies, and you know, we have the funding that's in place in some cases to tap into, but we don't have, let's say, like the infrastructure in place to support it. And I you know, earlier there was a discussion about electricity. And making sure we have grid readiness for some of these activities. And I would say that similarly, you know, with active transportation and with even the transit solutions that we're talking about, it's also about, you know, land use and right of way and those sorts of things. So I would say that the context of where investments are being made needs to be evaluated from the standpoint of when can we move to action? When can we start to realize, you know, the tangible benefit of the emissions reduction? Because I think sometimes we forget that not entirely, but sometimes I think we forget that what we're trying to do is we're trying to move the needle on an outcome. And that outcome is global warming potential and reducing our emissions for the state of Maryland. And so sometimes you have to throw everything at it and see, you know, what can be done in the near term. But I would mention the fact that I think, you know, there's probably some opportunities that may not be as exciting as converting your entire fleet over to electric vehicles in the near term, but that would have an impact in terms of the global warming potential. And so I'm talking about diesel engine retrofits and other opportunities that reduce the multiplying factor of global warming that I believe we're trying to mitigate here. So when I say prioritize, I'm just thinking about what can we do quickly to start reducing those emissions and reducing the impact on global warming.
Yeah, before I go to you, Sonia, let me just echo some something what Sandy said, because I've seen some analysis that the governor's proposals on transit-oriented development would have pay off significantly for very little dollars. And that, that is an example, I think, of something that greatly reduces vehicle miles traveled for very little dollars, but is not always popular. But the governor, I know, has championed it here. Sonia, I think you're next.
Hey, good morning. I think what we're all saying in different ways is that what we really need is like a prioritization framework that we can agree on and suggest. And I think, I've built them out in a number of different ways, but I think what everyone's saying is right. There's a variety of different criteria, right? You could think about it with like one axis being impact, and your impact could be financial impact, high, low, medium. It could be greenhouse gas reduction impact, right? And you could put the dollar costs and the GHGs on separate axes and see how programs line up. But I think this is more complicated than that, right? Because we really want to add a dimension of community impact and environmental justice. And so I think trying to layer that in would help us have a conversation around, do we try, to Sandy's point, you can't do everything at once, but do we intentionally try and focus on certain communities with some things while we go after the larger emitters in other places intentionally as a top priority? Another way you could look at this is timeline. Mark, to your point, it's really soon, the interim goal. And so do we really look at these and just take a really practical approach of saying, like, what can we move on now that either has some funding, has some partial funding, has some buy-in, and we can actually get going, right? And then build off of our successes, and what would be more in the nearer medium, couple, 3, 4, 5 years out, and what are probably more of our like big rocks to push up the hill that are maybe more 10 years out. You could do that at a whiteboard. We could do that asynchronously like this, kind of in an Excel sheet or on a PowerPoint slide, and try and move some things around. I'd be happy to work with you, Mark, or anyone to try and build out like a little framework that we could dig into, and maybe we do that between the meetings a little bit. But I think just taking a stab at it and getting everyone's opinions on, does this framework look right? What did we forget about? Does everybody at least share a few things that we think are the top priorities, or are we really all over the place? I think would be a really helpful starting point.
No, I think that's a very good idea, and I certainly would support trying to get your assistance in putting something together that, as a starting point, remember that the Climate Solutions Now Act, though it clearly sets, the 60% by 2031, for example, guide, it also established certain criteria that we were required to look at, environmental justice and economic development and jobs being ones that I know are particularly singled out. And so that might be a start for looking at the standards we have to evaluate for priorities. It may not be the entire list, but it might be a starting point. But I think that's a good point. Mark, I think you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think this is a really rich conversation about prioritization. I also think that it's pulling us away from the discussion of the funding mechanisms that I think should be the centerpiece of today's conversation. I mean, I think it's very practical to reflect on the fact that, yeah, maybe the General Assembly won't raise the amount of money that the plan says we need to raise. But I also think there's a danger in just sort of accepting that as a necessary premise and not talking about how some of these policies could be implemented in some form. So I'd be interested in doing that a little bit more, and especially talking about what additional analysis we may need on some of these policies, because I think, the modeling that's been done to now shows that, the cap and invest, for instance, can serve as a backstop that can reduce the emissions not avoided by the other measures in the plan. But we don't have a distributional analysis. There are a couple other revenue raising mechanisms that have been mentioned in the chat that could be modeled as potential sensitivities. I think, that's a potentially long conversation, and it's not one that I think we can have fully on today's call. But I do think we should talk about what next steps we can take to sort of move the ball forward in understanding what these policies could look like in various forms.
Yeah, and clearly, I think, I mean, funding recommendations are part of our role as well. The difficulty I think we have, and we have this, it's not limited to funding, it's everything that would be before the General Assembly, is that we can't get a recommendation that the group votes on before the end of the session. And we don't know what the session's going to do, which, and so we can certainly have these discussions. It's harder to deal with issues that are pending before the General Assembly than with issues that they haven't gotten to yet. But clearly, funding and potential sources of funding, I think, are subjects for our discussion here. I just, my own reticence, if you will, is sometimes we move on to the funding sources and we don't come back and finalize the prioritization of funding spends and funding needs. But both are on the table.
Well, I'll both take that as my cue to go to the second part of the presentation, which is potential funding sources that were called for in the plan. Also just, wanted to note that I really appreciated the conversation that we just had about developing a framework for prioritization. And I also just want to point out how great it is that we have both funders and analysts on the line who can think about ways to support this sort of MWG effort this year. So let me bring the slides back up, and this is maybe just one final slide maybe that we have that I have for today's deck, just to bring it together in terms of recapping what the plan said about excuse me, the areas of this, again, the scale of investment that we think is needed in terms of public funding, additional public funding, and the areas of prioritization that were identified in the plan. And that, of course, means what would we fund should we have the additional, $1 billion or some fraction of that. But I think that the point that you all were making is certainly a good one and well received on our end. If we're talking about a fraction of a fraction of the amount of money, where do you put those limited dollars, and really think about where to get the greatest bang for your buck on a co-benefits basis of emission reductions plus other benefits to society. So the funding sources that were floated in the plan, of course, include federal funding, right? Competitive grants or even loans that the state can go after. One example that I just wanted to share with you all is that we're currently pursuing EPA funding to help implement the building energy performance standards. It's a sizable amount of money that the EPA has in something called the Climate Pollution Reduction Program. So MDE is the lead on applying for that. But that's only, of course, one of a dozen different examples of competitive funding that we have available to us for various climate measures. And the state is very, very aggressively pursuing these funding opportunities. The plan calls for a range of options, right? In terms of floating concepts without ourselves committing to which of these is the right path for Maryland. Green revenue bonds. So a revenue bond, this is really just a way of thinking about how a revenue bond can be coupled with some of these other things. If there's additional revenue that would come in the future through the enactment of additional policies, be it, the cap and invest, carbon fee, hazardous substance fee, fuel burning vehicle fees, so on and so forth. It will take years before any new revenue from anything that is legislatively passed comes into place, because typically an agency needs a couple of years to develop enacting regulations before the revenue is collected from the covered entities. So what would happen is whenever the year is that the legislation passes, you need to look several years down the road before the revenue would actually start flowing to the state. And a green revenue bond is one concept that says, well, if we know that there's future revenue, then maybe we can issue a bond today that'll be repaid with that future revenue to get money flowing through Maryland's economy sooner. Cap and Invest program is one that we talked a bit about last year, but basically this is a program that other states are using, and Maryland participates as well. We have a Cap and Invest program for our fossil fuel power plants. This requires polluters to report their emissions, to keep their emissions below a cap level that slowly decreases, and to pay for carbon emission allowances for all of the emissions that they produce. Under a Cap and Invest program, the government uses a market-based mechanism to set the carbon price. So the government's role there is just to say, well, the maximum price and the minimum price might be this, but it's a market, a free market that allows for the actual carbon price to be set. I'm honing in on that aspect of Cap and Invest because that is one difference between it and a carbon fee. So another concept, and one that you see presented in, for instance, the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act, which is back before the legislature this year. Carbon fee approach is where the government sets the carbon fee rate instead of a market-based mechanism setting the fee rate. Another difference is with Cap and Invest, you have a specific cap that decreases over time. With a carbon fee, there's no cap. It's just that the assumption is that some sort of carbon pricing mechanism would potentially drive emissions lower because there's additional cost for the carbon-based products. A hazardous substance fee, several states have a fee on the transport of hazardous substances, including fossil fuels in the state. Maryland currently has something like this called the oil transfer fee. So for petroleum-based products, we're already collecting a small fee on the transfer of the substances in the state. The idea is to basically expand that to additional types of fossil fuels. And then another one that was floated in the plan are fees for fuel burning vehicles. This is actually linking back to something the Mitigation Working Group, I think, discussed last year. One thing that came up and what we said in the plan is that there's a lot of conversation right now about increasing registration fees for electric vehicles. And just as a really quick recap on this issue, EV owners, because they don't buy gasoline, aren't really contributing to the Transportation Trust Fund that maintains our roads and bridges and everything else, right? So there's been quite a bit of conversation about increasing registration fees for EV owners so that the EV owners are contributing to the Transportation Trust Fund to help maintain roads and whatnot. What we said in the plan, and aligned with some conversation that happened in the Climate Commission last year, is that if registration rates increase for EV owners, there should be a comparable increase in registration fees for fuel burning vehicles to help fund all these things that we're talking about funding here, right? So those are some of the funding concepts that were floated in the plan. And I guess I'll leave it to the co-chairs to decide what sort of conversation, if any, you all want to have around these funding concepts, or if this is a good segue for Kim to talk about some of the legislation that's active that would do some of this. But up to you, Kim and Mike.
Kim, I'll kick to you. I'd like to have a discussion about it, but if it tees it up by having your introduction on the legislation, that's fine.
Yeah, maybe I'll run through, because there is, so everybody's aware of what conversations are currently happening on these, and then we can go back to it. It's we could spend a long time talking about climate legislation. As Mark alluded to, there's a lot this year, but I'm going to focus on what was in the Climate Pollution Reduction Plan, and there were, I think, 6 recommendations in that plan that were legislatively based. And then I've got a couple others. Let me start with funding. So as Mark said, there was $90 million that the governor has allocated to 3 different spending buckets. That is great and really good. In fact, I also want to point out that 50% of those are targeted for LMI communities, which is also great. The 90 million will need to get approval from the legislature. So the budget committees, Senate Budget and Tax, House Appropriation is going to have to take this up. And so if you're inclined to support it, be sure and let those committee members know. Another funding bill, as Mark discussed, is HB 1008. There's a hearing in the House Environment and Transportation Committee on March 1st. This is the transport fee on fossil fuel, basically coal and natural gas. Estimations will be about $250 million from that fee, and it mimics the oil transport fee that the state already has in place. There's a bill, HB 1272, being heard in Economic Matters on March 7th, and that is to call on MDE in collaboration with the Maryland Commission on Climate Change to put together a cap and invest program. So that's moving that recommendation forward. And then today, actually, there's a bill, SB 958, and it'll be heard in the House on March 7th with bill number HB 1438. So the Renew Act, and this will generate $9 billion by charging international fossil fuel producers a one-time fee for putting the pollution out. So that bill's being heard today in the Senate EEE committee. So those are the funding bills. In terms of the recommendations that were in the climate plan, the power reform bill, HB 864, will be heard February 29th in Economic Matters. There is a bill on manufacturing. This came out of this committee on recommendations to remove or amend the exemption that currently exists for manufacturers from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. That will be heard on March 1st in Environment and Transportation. EV purchasing incentives, there was a hearing on February 15th, HB 689. EV ready multifamily homes, SB 695 will be March 1st in the Senate EEE committee, and on February 23rd, HB 889 in ENT. Two more and then I'll stop. The Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act, the carbon tax bill, will be heard on February 29th, HB 516 in Economic Matters. And then it was not explicitly on our list. However, I do want to mention that there's a bill, HB 993, that will be heard on March 14th in the Health and Government Affairs, or HGO, on creating a climate education week. And would be a week in April that would be designated Climate Education Week. And people would be urged to partake and participate in climate education programs. So that, I think, is a good first step in what we were talking about. So lots going on around funding is my main point there.
Kim, and I apologize, I had to turn my camera off again because I got Wi-Fi problem. Several people were asking for the bill numbers. Are those available on the League of Conservation Voters site so they can just pull them up that way? What's the easiest way to give them the bill numbers?
I'll tell you what, I'll put a little summary together for this committee and send it out by email.
Thank you.
Not all, yeah, that'll be the easiest way to get it. So I'll send it.
Okay. Comments from anyone? Arjun.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to make one comment, one suggestion. The list that you put up, Mark, the last one strikes me as especially regressive, increasing the registration fee on existing fossil fuel vehicles. It also hit rural people pretty hard. Low-income people tend to have older vehicles, Yeah, so I think that doesn't seem like a good idea. It might be replaced by taxes on new vehicles, new fossil fuel vehicles, according to in inverse proportional to the rated mileage. I think that would be a much better thing because it tends not to be passed on when it's a used car. I didn't see any allusion to wealth taxes. Uh, I did a back of the envelope calculation some years ago, not more than back of the envelope, some a rough calculation, but I think order of magnitude correct. By my calculation, 1/5 of 1%, 20 cents on every $100 of wealth of the wealthiest 0.1% of Maryland households would raise about $1 billion a year. Maybe 1/4%. Yeah, that order of magnitude. So I think I would suggest, because most of that list is fairly regressive. I pointed out the last one. I on the one hand, we're talking about energy equity and justice, and then we're talking taxes that, whether you call them fees or taxes or whatever, they are going to be regressive. And that's one of the problems I have. Carbon fees are very, very slow. So anyway, thank you.
Jennifer, I think you're next.
Yeah, I just want to note that I don't know that I agree with the assessment that a wealth tax is going to bring us more money, because when it was tried in other places, people relocated to other states and it wound up costing states money in the end. So I also think that some of these things are strategies that need to be concurrent. I don't see it as an either or. For example, the Renew Act, which I'm particularly excited about, all that money would come from multinational fossil fuel companies, and it's morally right. But after it's passed legally, the Attorney General says that we're on good legal standing, but we can assume that the fossil fuel companies will tie us up in court for some period of time. So I think we should do, the legal strategy of getting as much as we can from the people who broke the system in the first place. But that doesn't mean we don't have to urgently do many other strategies at the same time. And I do think that the cap and invest and the looking at increasing the fees for people that are shipping coal out of our ports and these sort of things that Delegate Dana Stein are working on are very important to do at the same time.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Mark, we had some suggestions that in between that we work on that with Sonia on that, the idea of coming back with some sort of chart. It may be that what we do is try to get that and bring it back to this group. And then by next month, we'll know better what the General Assembly is doing or not doing. So maybe we can take that into account in setting the agenda for next month. Are there any other comments or suggestions people want to raise, even outside of the particular agenda here, that since we've got some time to discuss? And then it probably would be wise if we can spare a little time for public comment. Sandy, you're first.
Hi, I just wanted to mention for the mitigation work group and your extended, stakeholder groups, that MDOT will be standing up a project submittal portal through the Maryland One Stop, and it will be for carbon reduction program funding in the sub-allocated areas. We have had conversations over the past several months with the metropolitan planning organizations, but I wanted to raise it with this group too, to let you know that there will be an MDOT grants roadshow that has 5 different events throughout the state. They include things like funding for active transportation, in addition to the funding that is sub-allocated for sub-recipients in Maryland through the carbon reduction program. And there should be some press releases and some social media posts about that coming out as well. So I just wanted to mention that there is a portal for project submittal as well as the opportunity for funding for eligible recipients through the carbon reduction program.
Sandy, could you, when you have that portal, send the link to Susan, who maintains our email list? And then I'll ask Susan to share it with each of the mitigation working group members.
Yeah, I'll have her send the link. I'll send her the link as well as any of the some more supporting fact sheets that we might have had developed. And I can also send the grants roadshow information to Susan as well.
Exactly. Okay. Mark, and then I think we'll have public comment starting with Jeff. Mark?
Thanks. I just wanted to, come back to the analysis question and ask whether it's not too soon to begin modeling some of these policies in some form, especially if we have, legislation on the cap and invest. I think that's probably concrete enough to model. I mean, we agree that different policies have different effects and some are more regressive than others. I think models are out there that can project what this particular impacts of some of these policies would be, and you can add different sensitivities that give you different flavors of that. So with acknowledgement that, we have an active legislative session, I don't think it's too soon to begin thinking through what some of these policies would look like, assuming that there's a budget that could be used to start looking into that.
I think you're right. There's a very limited analysis that's done on a fiscal note basis, but that's really how much money would be raised and what would be the impact on local government, that kind of thing. But you can see that now for any bill that is introduced and has a hearing date. Beyond that, obviously, the question I would assume that Mark would say is, where does the money come to spend a lot of analysis on the proposals? But I'll let him respond to that, and then we'll open to public comment.
Exactly right. And again, I see that there's some funders on the line. Feel free to reach out to me following this meeting if there might be interest in supporting ad hoc analysis for the MWG this year on looking at developing and implementing a prioritization framework for funding. So let's see, turning to public comment and just, quick note, thanks to everyone for a robust conversation today. I see Jeff Silva on the list, and others feel free to raise your hand as Donald has done, or otherwise put your name in the list and I'll get to you. So first up is Jeff, and then I'll turn to Donald.
Jeff, are you muted?
Yes, no, I'm not. I hope you could hear me now.
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Hey, thank you very much for all the encouraging work and the proposals that I'm hearing. This is wonderful. It's a shame it's 20 years late, but here we are. But right now, I put a message in the call-in message box concerning a problem that has to be dealt with, and I would hope it's going to be dealt with this legislative session. The fossil fuel companies profit from their climate pollution that make atmospheric calamities more intense, more widespread, lengthens their duration, increased recovery difficulties, and takes more lives. The insurance industry then increases policy premiums paid by citizens to own or rent property and a vehicle. They receive more cash flow to cover the future storm damage payouts. So this is not a consumer discretionary spending. If you're going to own property, you're going to have to insure it. Otherwise, you can't get financing for it. Soon, Maryland citizens will not be able to afford the higher insurance costs required of having a home or a car. Insurance protection takes the policyholder's risk of storms and spreads the damage across a wider population. Our insurance payments are increased because the damage fossil fuel company products have on Earth's atmosphere. With cunning, they are punishing Marylanders from their climate pollution and then get our insurance money reinvested in their operations that sabotage the very purpose of the mitigation working group. Immediately, this commission must recommend to state elected officials to pass legislation in this session to direct the Maryland Insurance Administration to instruct the insurers operating in Maryland to stop investing in fossil fuel companies and divest their current holdings if insurers are collecting premiums in Maryland. Now, I've met now in the ECO work group meeting, I was able to talk directly to Mr. I, who said he worked for the administration. I brought up this issue, and he said it's required to have legislation redirect the policies of his agency. So thank you very much for this opportunity, but you could see the whiplash, the cruel double action of this financial exchange that's taking place, and it needs to end. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Donald.
Hi, Donald Goldberg, Climate Law and Policy Project. I just wanted to mention that we have prepared a primer on Cap and Invest, just laying out the basics of how it works and some of the Maryland specific issues. We were not going to release it until April because we didn't want to distract from some of the other some of the bills that have been introduced this session that are also on the list of possible funding mechanisms. So we didn't want to create any crosstalk. So we thought we would hold this until April. But now that I see there's a bill introduced by Delegate Stein, I think it's probably appropriate to go ahead and release this and give people an opportunity to start thinking about Cap and Invest and how it would differ from some of these other options. So I put a link in the chat to my email. Anybody that would like an advanced copy of our Cap and Invest primer can just email me and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Thanks, Donald. I don't see anyone else with a hand up or who put the name in the chat. Ah, great. Andra, thanks for joining us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. And thank all of you for what you're doing. I just didn't want to say anything because I'm losing my voice, but I hope you can understand what I'm saying. Just want to mention that the Climate Crisis and Environmental Justice Act that you referred to earlier is really a great mechanism for funding the reduction plan, pollution reduction plan that the government has submitted. I believe that I think the plan called for about $1 billion, $1 billion to cover the Climate Solutions Now Act plans. The CCEJ will generate more than $1.7 billion a year once fully implemented, on average, over $18 billion in 10 years. So it will more than pay for the plans that we are putting in place to reduce carbon. But in addition to that, which I think is so important and is why we don't support cap and trade, is because it protects not just low and moderate income communities and individuals, but those who are overburdened and underserved. They're the ones that really suffer the most from climate change. And we don't believe that they should bear the burden of correcting the problem. And this bill is one that does no harm. It holds the polluters responsible, and it put money back into the state that is going to help us mitigate the problems that we have here in Maryland. The hearing on this legislation, on this bill, is on February 29th, leap year, at 1 p.m. in Economic Matters.
Great. Thank you, Wanda. Jennifer.
I just wanted to note that the annual meeting for the philanthropists who focus on climate change, by coincidence, is taking place in Baltimore this year. So the National Conference for the Environmental Grant Makers will be here in March. I put the link to it. So if people are looking for philanthropy to help fund thinking about these issues, those philanthropists will be in town then.
Timely flag. Thank you, Jennifer. Any other public comments before we adjourn today? Seeing none. Kim, Mike, any closing remarks before you wrap up?
No, my Wi-Fi is crashing again, so I think I've said all I need to say.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I put all the bills in the chat, and I'll send them to Susan to post wherever we need to. So thanks for a great conversation today.
Thanks, and we'll also be posting the slides from today's meeting on our on the MWG's website. Take care. The MWG will meet again in about a month from now. Should be on your calendars if you're members, and otherwise we'll be updating the calendar online with the future meetings. Have a good one. We'll see you then.